くの物語。雅楽とは、雅楽はどこから来たの？縄文時代、弥生時代、古墳時代、聖汁洞窟、莫高窟、正倉院、仏教、神道、平家物語。ペルシャ、インド、チベット、敦煌、隋朝、唐朝、高句麗、百歳、新羅、ベトナム。雅楽とは、長く遅い音楽とダンス。
Gagaku is music and dance from Asia, and indigenous music from Japan. Gagaku is the oldest orchestra in the world.
雅楽はいつ設立されましたか？
Gagaku was founded 701. It means elegant music. Gagaku or yaolu comes from China, represents the former Chinese court music. Is seen as good or right music in the Analects of Confucius. Yaolu was performed at royal court and temples. But in Gagaku you can find only the Tang Banquet music. Yanyue, pronounced as Gagaku in Japan, is only used as a generic term. Had a great influence on Gagaku and all of Japanese music. We will take a closer look at Yanyue later. This music and musical instruments came to Japan via Korea, along with Buddhism. Music and dance from other countries in Southeast Asia also came to Gagaku. The long way from Gagaku. It began 30,000 years ago, partly over former land bridges, and from the ocean. Ceramics come from the Jomon period, which begins around 16,500 and is dated to 300 BC. The name Jomon is a translation of cord-marked ceramics. The mostly female, 10 to 30 centimeters high dogu figures that were found are unique from this period. The Jomon period is followed by the Yayue period, 300 BC to 300 AD. Another immigration came from the northeast and east, and spread to the north. New ceramics and agricultural technologies were introduced. The north, the formal Jomon culture is still represented today by the Ainu ethnic group from Hokkaido. Kofen and Asuka Period, 300 to 710 AD, collectively called the Yamato Period. The records of Weiji say that Queen Himiko was the first ruler of the Kingdom of Wad Japan. Japan begins to structure itself. Buddhism reaches the country. Cultural exchange with China and Korea. Famous from this time are the Hanua clay figures as grave goods. The Hanua figures attest to the fact that even before Gagaku, there was a separate music and musical instrument culture. The origin of the wagon zither, which is still played in the Gagaku today, can be seen in the Hanua figures. Music and dance from Korea to Japan at Yamato Period. Korea had a great influence on the music history of Gagaku. From the 4th century onwards, a very significant period of this cultural exchange taking place. Politically troubled times, the influence of Buddhism, alliances, all of this influenced the cultural exchange. This period is also called the Three Kingdoms of Korea. The Three Kingdoms of Korea are Baekje, Silla and Goguryeo. Let's take a look at the connections between Japan and the various Korean kingdoms during the Yamato period. Biyo, 200 BC to 494 AD. A kingdom in the north. A cultural exchange took place. Gaya, a kingdom in the south between Baekje and Silla, traded with Japan, was conquered by Silla. Gaya is unforgettable because it brought the Gaya-gem zither, which is still very popular today. Baekje, along with the China Tang Dynasty, had the greatest influence on Japanese development and Japanese music history. Diplomatic relations with Japan. Buddhism was already established in Baekje. Baekje was a respected sea power. Baekje passed the technological and intellectual progress onto Japan. Baekje allied with Japan against Goguryeo and Silla. The relationship with Baekje brought the Chinese writing system, Buddhism, iron-working weapons, and other technologies to Japan. Baekje monks brought Buddhism to Nara, Japan in 552. In exchange, Japan provided military assistance. Many refugees from Baekje immigrated to Japan. Sengoku is a harp from Baekje. Sengoku disappeared.
Goguryeo.
Goguryeo ruled the north of the Korean peninsula for a long time. The alliances between Goguryeo, Silla, and Baekje changed several times. As already mentioned, Goguryeo take over Biyo in the north and turned against Baekje. This kingdom was able to assert itself against the Sui dynasty. Instruments from the Kingdom of Goguryeo. Sengoku, a harp that has disappeared. Jiamungo, a percussion zither. A hyang pipa. A double reed flute called the piri. Baekje also had a piri variant. Goguryeo was conquered by the Tang-Silla alliance in 668. Silla 57 BC, 935 AD. Silla was on an expansion course. When Gagaku and Baekje formed an alliance against Silla, Silla allied with the Tang Dynasty. 660, Baekje was conquered by Silla Tang, and shortly afterwards also Gagaku. The victorious divided the peninsula, until Silla was the only power. This time is known as Unified or Later Silla. Later Silla had existed until 935. At the end of the Later Silla period, the old kingdoms tried again to rebuild their old empires. But it failed. In the north, the Balhae Empire was formed. The medieval kingdom of Goryeo was formed from the new unrest. Goryeo remained stable until 1392. After that, the country was ruled by the Joseon dynasty for 500 years. The Daijin flute dates from the Silla period, and is still played today. And there was Tamna, the island kingdom in the south. Tamna was able to exist independently, with skill, and trading relationships until the 14th century. Japan started keeping records in the 8th century. Korea started keeping records in the 12th century. Most of the evidence from this period can be found in the chronicles of the Chinese dynasties. That leaves a lot of room for interpretation and speculation. Cultural exchange with Korea. 453, legendary Emperor Rinyu of Japan dies. The king of Silla sends 80 musicians to Wa to show his grief. It is said that there was a permanent orchestra from Korea in Japan. 552, Baekje monks bring Buddhism to Japan. 554, 4 musicians from Baekje come to Japan. It is said that the many new diseases and illnesses are the punishment of the Shinto kamis, because Buddhism has come to the country. The first temples are burned down, and the Buddhist gifts are thrown into the rivers. (592), beginning of the reign of Empress Suiko. Suiko appoints the legendary Crown Prince Shotoku as regent. Nihon Shoki called Shotoku, who introduces the first Japanese constitution. Together with Suiko, he established Buddhism as the state religion in Japan. Suiko and Shotoku built the oldest temples in Japan.
四天王寺、飛鳥寺、法隆寺。
A carpenter from Baekje, who helped build Shitenoji Temple, founded a temple building company, the Kongogumi, in Japan. This company became the oldest company in the world, not owned by the family until 2006. Big respect for Kongogumi. Connections to the Sui dynasty. The Son of Heaven where the sun rises, to the Son of Heaven where the sun sets, may good health be with you. A famous letter from Shotoku to the Sui Emperor. The Sui Emperor was a little outraged by the choice of words, but diplomatic relations with Japan began. 612, according to Nihon Shoki, a man named Mimaiji from Baekje came to Nara, and brought the mask drama dance Gagaku with him. It is said that Mimaiji studied Gagaku in Wu, China. 630, Emperor Jomei sends the first mission to Tang China, capital Changjian. (669), Silla has stabilized as the Korean kingdom. Also the northern Balhae was stable for a while. cultural exchange with Tang China. Tang Dynasty, 617 to 907. Between the 7th and 9th centuries there were 19 Japanese missions to Tang capital Changjian. Officials, priests, doctors and painters were sent to Tang to study and to bring new knowledge to Japan. 694. The city of Fujiwara-kyo is built on the model of the Tang metropolis Changjian. The rulers of Fujiwara-kyo were Empress Jito, Emperor Mamu and Empress Gime. The missions to Tang were up to 500 travelers, and 4 ships. Some ships were lost in the sea. (701). Chinese government system Toyohara and Confucianism came to Japan. The official office for the performance and broadcast of music and dance was Gagaku, also called the Bureau of Music. Also knew what Naikyobo, Women's Music Pavilion. This was the official beginning of Gagaku. Different music and dance from Tang China have been transferred to Japan. The Tang culture was at the peak of its musical culture. On the Silk Road, music came from Persia, India, Vietnam, or the Kingdom of Kaka. This enormous variety was performed at court as banquet music. It was called Yanyue. Cave paintings in the Mogai Caves in Dunhuang, or in the Kizil Caves in Xinjiang, testify to this day of the enormous diversity of this time. Instruments such as the pipa lute, or the Guan double reed flute, have spread to Korea and Japan, where they have developed further, and have become national symbols of musical culture. Some of these instruments disappeared or were replaced by others in the Gagaku, and some have survived only in Japan. The character Gagaku means Yayue, but is pronounced as Gagaku in Japan. The banquet music Yanyue was transferred to Japan, and not the ritual music Yayue. The word Gagaku is used as an umbrella term. All of the new music from Tang has been grouped together as Togaku, Tang music. The capital changed to Haijokyo, today's Nara. Haijokyo was connected to the Silk Road and developed as an international city. The first official records were written 712, the Kajiki, Records of Ancient Matters, and 720, the Nihon Shoki, the Chronicles of Japan. (717), Kibi no Makibi was sent to the Tang court. With him on the ship were the scholar Abe no Nakamaro, and the priest Genbo. Kibi stayed in China for a few years. It is said that he brought the game of Go, silk embroidery, and the biwa with him. In some sources, Kibi is also credited with inventing the katakana script. Kibi brings the Yueshu yaolu from China. Yueshu yaolu, important records about writings on music, is a compendium on music compiled on imperial order of Empress Wu Zetian, the only empress of China. Yueshu yaolu is still preserved in Japan as a temporal document to this day. On his second mission to China, Kibi was sent as a vice ambassador. Kibi made his career up to Minister Daijin. Abe no Nakamaro stayed in China and made a career as a civil servant. His attempts to return to Japan failed several times. He is also known for one of his poems that is filled with intense longing for his home in Nara. (736). A monk named Bodhidharma from Kampa, with an Indian monk named Bodhizena, came to Japan. Bodhidharma brings the ritual art of orchestral music and dance, called Rinyu Gaku. They arrived in Japan with the delegation of Taiji no Hironari, together with the returnees, Kibi no Makibi, and also the monk Genbo. Genbo brought a lot of literature from the Chinese Buddhist canon with him. All of this new music was quickly established and performed along with traditional music. A spectacular ceremony took place in Japan. At the peak of this cultural diversity, the eye-opening ceremony of the newly built, gigantic 15-meter-high bronze Buddha was celebrated in the Todaiji Temple. Those involved in the construction of the statue, the temple, and the ceremony were Emperor Shomu, Monk Robin, Monk Gyoki, and head of the ceremony, Monk Bodhizena. More than 10,000 guests were there. It is said that many were tied to the Buddha statue with ribbons during the opening of the eyes. Emperor's artists, musicians and dancers from mainland Asia, after the central religious part of the eye-opening ceremony was completed, started a music festival with musicians of the Toragaku genre, songs and dances of indigenous origin, by women and the next two by men, a range of performing arts from mainland Asia, a stumping dance with a solemn Chinese text, acrobatic performance, dance of Chinese origin, and acrobatic Chinese dance. 3 dances of the Rinyu Gaku, namely Bosatsu, Baro and Batoa Korean dance, Tang dance, for women, 3 Korean dances. 756, Empress Komyo donated hundreds of items to Todaiji Temple. A separate warehouse, a treasury was built on the temple area, the Shoso Inn. You can find instruments that were used in the eye-opening ceremony in the Shoso Inn. During the Han period, other cultural goods came from the Silk Road to the Shoso Inn. (759) Yueshu, the oldest extant collection of Japanese waka, was compiled by the poet Otomo no Yakamoki. (794) The new capital is now Hankyo. Hankyo is today's Kyoto. Gagaku changes from ceremonial and religious to court music for aristocrats. New compositions were written, old pieces were reinterpreted. Gagaku blossomed in his courtly environment. Pure music became popular. The change of nature and the seasons was celebrated with Gagaku. Japanese and Chinese poems and stories were performed with music. Saibara and Rui. After intensive studies of all the new music, they have begun to be classified and categorized. Imported music was divided into two main groups: Komegaku, music and dance from the three Korean kingdoms, and the kingdoms later Silla or Goryeo, as well as from the north of the Korean peninsula, such as Bali or Biu. Main color green. Tugaku, music and dance from the Tang Dynasty, music and dance from India, from Vietnam to the Kingdom of Kampa, and from the Asian mainland. Main color red. In addition to Komegaku and Togaku, there is also the poem Saibara and Rui, and indigenous music and dance, called Kuniburi no Unamai. The three main performances are Kangen, instrumental music; Bugaku, dance with music; and Kyaru, music with poetry. (838 to 839), the last Tang mission took place. A planned Tang mission for 894 was cancelled. The Tang Dynasty ends violently in an uprising. In China began a chaotic period of 5 dynasties and 10 empires. Music and dance became an important part of life at the Japanese court. Gagaku offices were opened in Osaka, Nara and Hankyo. The musicians specialized and passed on their knowledge to the next generations within their families. They became professional musicians. The Japanese court is divided and 2 large warrior clans are fighting for supremacy. That ends in the Genpei War, where the Minamoto clan win in the end, and a new era begins in Japan. Because the military clans were founded from court nobles, who had also learned Gagaku, they founded cultural centers for their clans. This leads to impressive temples and shrines, where Gagaku was an important part. The Minamoto, also called Genji, formed their cultural center at the Kamakura Shrine, Tsurugaoka Hachiman-gu. The Toyohara, also called Hike, formed their cultural center at the Itsukushima Shrine. Even after the victory, the Minamoto clan valued the Toyohara's cultural achievements. The Itsukushima Shrine, with the huge tree in the water, is still one of the most famous objects of Japan worldwide. 794 to 1185, literature and music from, and about the Heian period. The Pillow Book, Mikurin no Soshi, by Say Shonagen. The Pillow Book is a collection of lists, gossip, poetry, observations and complaints, written during her years in the court. The Tale of the Hike. Epic testimony of the Minamoto Anti-era struggle for supremacy. The stories were passed on by blind monks, playing with a biwa, also called the hike biwa. The most widespread version of the hike Monogatari epic to this day was dictated to his pupil Teichi by the blind monk Akashi Kakuichi. The Tale of Genji, also called Genji Monogatari. Published before 1021, by Murasaki Shikibu. The Tale of Genji is a 54-chapter novel about Prince Genji, during the Heian period. A testimony to the cultural diversity of the Heian period, it includes descriptions of the music at court, like Gagaku. The Tale of Genji has inspired many artists around the world. The Tale of Genji is said to be the first novel in the world. Koken Wakashu, a collection of ancient and modern poems. A collection of Japanese poetry commissioned by the Emperor. It was the most influential implementation of the ideas about poetry of the time, and dictated the form of Japanese poetry until the late 19th century. Also influenced haiku poetry. As in the Tang Dynasty, the cultural exchange with neighboring countries also had an enormous influence on the future in Japan. All the new impressions were collected, categorized and implemented in the best possible way. The rivalry between the Minamoto and Taira clan meant that they wanted to outdo each other culturally. This made Gagaku an independent and unique art that still used the name from the Tang Dynasty, but has already developed into a new Japanese musical art. Gagaku was now the collection point for the music art. The culture centers of the Minamoto and the Taira clan were crucial for the further development of Gagaku. But there were also performances at temples and shrines. 1185 to 1333, Kamakura period, where the reign of the new ruler was also called the Bakufu government. The first shogun was Minamoto no Yoritomo. This period is known as the rise of the warrior class and feudalism. The shogunate period in Japan begins with the legitimation of the court. Court culture disappeared, but Gagaku continued to be supported. Gagaku's performance opportunities were now limited. Gagaku played on stages in temples and shrines. The three big Gagaku guilds were very isolated from each other. The new warrior class wanted to expand their power, but also had to contend with Mongol invasion attempts. Gagaku lost more attention. 1336 to 1573, Muramaki Period. The attempt of the nobles to bring the court back to power failed. The imperial court split into a north and a south for 50 years. The seat of government moved back to Kyoto. The new ruler was the Ashikaga clan from a branch of the Minamoto family. The nobles lost their influence, and the Ashikaga took full political control of Japan. At the end of the Ashikaga and Muramaki periods, there was a 100-year period of war, also known as the Sengoku Period. This warlike time left deep marks on the aristocratic court society. The Gagaku musicians from the war zone of Kyoto fled to the land side. Some found shelter in temples. There was a new form of theater that was becoming increasingly popular, and replaced Gagaku. The No Theater. The No Theater has its origins in Sengoku. Sengoku, a form of entertainment reminiscent of the modern circus, came to Japan from China in the 8th century with the Tang missions. Sengoku mixed with indigenous traditions, developed further, and the theater form Sarugaku emerged from this collaboration. A Sarugaku performance in front of the young shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu took over the patronage, and Sarugaku became No. Also called No-gaku. However, the end of Gagaku could be prevented, because the music family clans of Nara and the Shintonoji Temple in Osaka continued to hold on to the traditions and pass them on to the next generations. An important work was written for Gagaku, Taigensho, written by a Gagaku musician, Toyohara Sumiyaki, when court music seemed threatened with extinction. You can find No stages in temples and shrines, often next to Gagaku. The oldest No stage can be admired in Itsukushima Shrine, the famous shrine built by the Toyohara clan as a cultural center. Azuki Momoyama Period. A short but very important time. It is the last phase of the 100 Years' War. The newly imported weapons technology from Europe led to a quick conquest under one rule. Toyotomi Hideyoshi used his skill as a general, and the new weapon technology, and completed the unification of Japan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was also a patron of the arts. His plans to march through Korea and attack China were rejected by the Korean Joseon dynasty. He then invaded Korea. After he was able to record some war successes, he was pushed back by the Korea-China alliance. The Korean Gagaku internal ships were able to interrupt military supplies from Japan. The Japanese way of tea, founded by Sen no Riku, known in the West as the tea ceremony, originated at this time. The Gagaku musicians were called to Kyoto, the time when the three big family groups started working together. The remaining traditions and elements have been brought together. After the unification of the country, and the unification of the Gagaku musicians, Toyotomi showed a Gagaku performance for the Emperor in his palace. (1603 to 1868), Edo period, also called Tokugawa period. The new capital was moved to Edo, today's Tokyo. An isolation from the other countries began. The new technical and medical achievements from Europe were nevertheless studied further. Trade relations with Holland remained limited, with the Holland Studies, also known as Reigaku, taking place. A 250-year period of peace began under the rule of the new Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa established a new order of power. Emperors, court aristocrats, shoguns, daimyo, samurai. 1603, the Maiko, Okuni, founded a new order, called kabuki. It developed into a popular theater. Kabuki is an event. 3 main kabuki stages were formed, in Edo, in Kyoto, and in Osaka. Gagaku also experienced a new comeback. The Tokugawa clan called the musicians of the 3 Gagaku centers to Edo. They were needed for ceremonial performances. Gagaku musicians were recorded in the newly built Shinto shrine Nikko Toshogu, located in the north of Edo. The 3 family unions and Gagaku schools from Kyoto, Nara, and Osaka began to work together. Gagaku saw the second peak since the Han period. Scientists and Confucian scholars started research on Gagaku. Performance standards have been introduced. The musicians were paid like professional musicians, depending on their level of training. Gagaku opened up and became popular. Buddhism, Shinto, aristocracy, peasants, merchants liked Gagaku. The music rediscovered by the researchers was revived. Kamegaku, Togaku, Kuniburi no Unamai, Saibara and Roi found a home again in Gagaku. The 250 years of isolation came to an end, due to external pressure. That led to a social change. It was the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, the end of the Bakufu government, the end of the samurai. The Meiji era, 1868 to 1912. The emperor came back to power. The new emperor was Matsuhito. As already during the Han period, a great cultural exchange began. This time with the Europeans and the USA. Japan has managed to achieve the same technical progress as the Europeans and the USA in just a short time. This led to renewed social upheaval, and a permanent army was founded. With the newly won power, neighboring countries were occupied. Edo was renamed Tokyo. The emperor's seat is moved from Kyoto to Tokyo. Musicians from the 3 centers were again called to the court in Tokyo. The Gagaku regulations have been changed. It was now possible for ordinary citizens to become a court musician, without a centuries-long pedigree of the Gagaku musician clans. A new music office was founded, as a continuation of the Gagaku Ryo, founded in 701. In addition to traditional training, the musicians now also had to learn a Western instrument. Since then, Gagaku musicians have also given performances of Western classical music, with great success. As many musicians were called to Tokyo, there was a shortage of professional musicians in the other cities. The ceremonies at temples and shrines were now also played by amateur Gagaku groups. To become a new court musician, for example, you had to complete a 10-year training course. Included were, among other things, dancing, singing, a Japanese stringed instrument, a Japanese wind instrument, a Western instrument. Because of the long, spatially separated Gagaku families, the same Gagaku pieces have developed differently in each family and are mostly no longer identical. The different pieces were standardized, also called the Meiji scores. The Gagaku pieces were returned to the imperial family as an official act, and were then passed back to the musicians of the newly established department. This new department was renamed and restructured several times, until it was housed in what is now the Imperial Household Agency. The new, uniform ensemble compositions have thus been established. It is said that today's pace of play is slower than it was in Meiji era, 1912 to 1926, the Taisho era, The exchange with the West continued, industrialization began, democratic movements and power struggles took place, the First World War took place. The Taishokoto is a fine example of the turbulent times. The key system is reminiscent of the typewriter technology of that time. Sho era, 1926 to 1989, time of great changes, nationalism, totalitarianism, invasions in neighboring countries, radical changes after World War II. 1945, the Empire of Japan becomes the State of Japan, democratic reforms, transition to a constitutional monarchy, with a liberal democracy. After the terrible consequences of World War II, the culture began to be consolidated again. Gagaku was recognized and designated as an intangible cultural asset. The Gagaku court musicians, from all three families, were honored as keepers of this tradition. 1966, the National Theater is built. The traditional genres Gagaku, Kabuki, No and Bunraku have found a home here. They also work out new compositions for Gagaku or play pieces from before the Meiji period, from before the Meiji scales. Heisei era, 1989 to 2019. Gagaku entry into the UNESCO World Heritage at 2009, as an important intangible cultural asset of Japan and of course for all of us. Today's music department is responsible for the performance of Gagaku, for Western music and palace rites, for ceremonies, and for the training of the next generation of musicians. Founded even before the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, Gagaku is an enormously important cultural treasure in Japan. The future of Gagaku will probably be decided between the choice of how much to modernize or how long to rely on pure tradition. Gagaku was always open to new and old influences. Gagaku always found a way to experience both. The origin of Gagaku begins in the Silk Road, which brought the Tang Dynasty to cultural bloom, brought from China via Korea and with missions to Japan, mixed with the indigenous music of Japan, music and dance from Korea, India, Vietnam, and the musical culture of the Han court. Developed further by the shogunates, standardized in the Meiji era, preserved by the musicians. In Gagaku you can see a part of history in East Asia. Perhaps Gagaku is also a testimony to Buddhism that spread across East Asia at the same time. Although the Buddhist ritual chant Shamyo did not become part of Gagaku, Buddhism was nevertheless very important for the spread of music in East Asia. In Japan, newly built and established Buddhist temples were also keepers of the Gagaku tradition. Masks for traditional Gagaku dances are still available in various designs in temples and shrines. Thank you for your time.
お時間をいただきありがとうございます。 時間をいただきありがとうございます。